So it's my pleasure to introduce Ian Scoones. Ian is a professor at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex, an ecologist by original training. He works on issues of agricultural and environmental change, particularly in Africa. He's the principal investigator of the ERC Advanced Grant Project, PASTORS, Pastoralism, Uncertainty, and Resilience, Lessons from the Margins. Over to you, Ian. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So let me share my screen. So in this talk, I want to think a little bit more in a little bit more detail about the relationship between livestock, methane, and climate justice. Now, I know this is not a common focus because these tend to be rather technical debates, but I want to convince you that it's important if we want to address a just transition in the face of climate change. First, some starting points. Shefali's covered some of these, but it's worth re-emphasizing. Methane is a really important climate-forcing gas. Reducing it is absolutely imperative, although overall carbon dioxide is more important in the long term. Anthropogenic methane emissions come from agriculture, for sure, but also from fossil fuels and waste. Fossil fuel and waste emissions together add up to about 1.5 times the agricultural emissions, which are mostly from livestock. So yes, ruminant livestock produce methane, no question about that, and it's estimated to amount to 120 to 140 million tons per year. But there are also some important questions here. Which livestock, where, and where should global policy efforts focus? These are just more complex questions, which both raise important issues around justice, and that's the focus of my talk. So my reflections emerge from an ongoing project called PASTORS, which Shefali introduced, which is working in 6 countries across the world. And it starts from an understanding of pastoral systems, extensive livestock systems on the ground in different contexts. And during the project, we become increasingly concerned about the way the debate about climate and livestock and methane is going. So first, a little bit of history. In 1991, there was an important report produced by CSE in Delhi by Anil Agarwal and Sunita Narayan, and it was a reaction to WRI's report on aggregate emissions at that time. It argues that it matters where emissions come from, and they made the important distinction between what they called survival and luxury emissions. Now, this is a theme that I picked up on in several papers with colleagues on livestock and climate, making the case that we need to differentiate between different livestock systems, not lump everything together in a simple aggregate narrative that all livestock are bad for the planet. So in sum, it's a debate about justice, but what do we mean by justice? I want to introduce 3 types of justice: epistemic justice, whose knowledge counts; distributional justice, who wins and who loses; procedural justice, who gets included and excluded. And I want to argue that all 3 of these are absolutely crucial when we're discussing livestock and methane, but are often missed. The problem is that the current debate just doesn't address questions of justice. There are big sweeping statements we see all the time based on global aggregate modeling that just offer far too little nuance. There are equally many voices missing from these debates, notably small-scale livestock producers and pastoralists. With methane emissions rising up the agenda, correctly so, and with countries signing up to the Global Methane Pledge, which was already mentioned, fingers of blame are pointed. The industrial producers say, yeah, we can fix all this through technology, feed additives, drugs, vaccines, even masks for cattle, without changing the system. And meanwhile, extensive livestock producers, who are usually not at the table, are seen as the real villain, blamed by the industry folk and environmentalists alike, in a sort of weird convergence of narratives on this issue. So let's dig into the debate a little further. How are these arguments constructed? On the basis of what data and what type of analyses? I want to suggest that the current approach creates serious epistemic injustices as certain views and certain types of data are excluded. Much of this, of course, arises inadvertently. The way the big figures, the classic 14.5% of anthropogenic emissions coming from livestock, are derived from what are called life cycle analysis. All the emissions are calculated across the value chain. But where does the data that go into these analyses come from? First, most of it is derived from well-documented commercial industrial farms. For example, one very frequently quoted paper published in the journal Science looked at many different farms and a number of different processes, but only focused on what they called commercially viable units, mostly from Europe and North America. Yet when these results are aggregated and shared, this is assumed to be the full story. These figures are then used by the media, campaign groups, data compilation sites like Our World in Data, as if the results apply to all livestock everywhere. The result is often false equivalence being made. Cows are as bad as cars, or cows are as bad as even coal. And I think this really distorts the debate. What then do we have to look out for when we see these figures? How should we nuance the livestock and methane debate? And I want to mention 4 different elements. First is the whole question of global warming potential measures, how to deal with different greenhouse gases in aggregate emission statements or CO2 equivalents. Without getting into the technical details, it all depends on how you treat time and the permanence of different gases, flows and pulses within the atmosphere. Methane is significant in the short term, but it decays over 12 years or so. Carbon dioxide, by contrast, sticks around. So what GWP measure you use makes a massive difference to the final figure. The graph shows 2 measures for livestock in Austria, quite a big difference, as you can see. This is not saying that methane is not important, it surely is, but different priorities exist depending on your policy objective and your time preference. Second is the measure of methane emissions you actually use, the emissions intensity. Most data that are used, say for the IPCC reports, come from well-bred animals in the global north, fed in respiration chambers. But if you actually measure livestock emissions in situ in Africa, as ILRI have done in Kenya, then the data is very different, perhaps 15% or more lower than these figures that are widely used. This is because such animals are physiologically and genetically different. They feed in particular ways, perhaps even browsing methane-reducing tannins, and so emissions are lower. Third is how emissions are measured in relation to the wider system. So are we interested in emissions per animal, per area, or per system? Looking at a system, as CIRAD have done in Senegal, then we get a very different picture. Distribution of manure, incorporation of dry matter, and methanogenesis emissions have to be looked at all together. Some system studies suggest that extensive livestock systems, particularly mobile ones, can be net negative or at least in balance. Very different to an intensive, concentrated, fixed, contained system of industrial livestock. And finally, there is the question of additionality and the issue of baselines that are used. Work by Pablo Manzano and colleagues has compared emissions in a natural wild system, an extensive system, and an intensive livestock systems. And extensive systems, he finds, are not hugely different to a system dominated by wild herbivores, and therefore, in that sense, are not additional. For intensive systems, it's of course a very different story. So how and what you measure makes a massive difference. Each of these 4 elements have resulted in major biases in aggregate models that act against extensive livestock systems. This is what I call epistemic injustice. This matters as if we're to address emissions, which we must, then we have to decide how to do this and where. Should our policy efforts be focused on the sort of pastoralists we work with in our study sites, as in these pictures, or on industrial livestock systems, or maybe even on quick wins, such as sealing leaks in gas pipelines? For example, emissions from gas infrastructure in Turkmenistan last year was reported to be more than the total emissions from the whole of the UK across all sectors, and certainly much more than all extensive livestock producers in the rangelands across the world. Extensive small-scale livestock producers live in marginal areas, often marginalized economically and politically, and in the extensive rangelands where they live, which make up half the world's land surface, so they're important, there are often very few alternative livelihoods. Yes, they contribute to emissions, but at a low level with limited or even no additionality. So should such people be demonized and targeted for our global efforts to address climate change, or should our efforts be focused elsewhere? So if we're to address questions of distributional justice, we urgently need to differentiate, once again highlighting the difference between survival and luxury emissions. And this means refining the debate and the processes by which decisions are made within international climate policy. In our policy discussions on climate issues, let's avoid the aggregate statistics and the simplistic headline figures. In the processes of reporting nationally determined contributions to emissions, let's not just use the aggregate data and unrealistic emission factors. In the monitoring and verification processes around methane, let's differentiate between systems, between luxury and survival emissions. And in the discussions about livestock and climate in policy, let's involve those who know about local conditions and production systems. Researchers, yes, but pastoralists especially. At COP26 in Glasgow, I attended a meeting convened by a very well-known environmental organization on methane and livestock, and was shocked to find it totally dominated by those selling proprietary technologies for reducing methane in industrial livestock. No mention of extensive small-scale systems at all. This then is a question of procedural justice, of differentiation and of inclusion. Who is at the table and whose voices count? So in sum, this means when discussing methane and livestock, it means thinking about justice. Because epistemic, distributional, and procedural injustices are rife in this debate currently and are being made worse by inadequate science, vested industrial interests, simplistic environmentalism, shoddy media reporting, and biased international climate policy processes. If the rights of small-scale, extensive livestock producers are to be protected and a just climate transition is to be achieved, this, I think, needs to change. And that's a link to some of our work. So thank you very much.